Assessment literacy means that teachers know what they're assessing, why they're assessing it, how to assess it, what the possible problems with that assessment might be, how to prevent these problems from occurring before they actually happen, and what the possible negative consequences of poor or inaccurate assessment are. So another reason why it's important for teachers to be assessment literate is that we potentially spend as much as half of our teaching time in the classroom and beyond on assessment and assessment related activities. So where do we begin? Well, it's a big field, isn't it? But we should ask ourselves a few questions before we begin the task of designing our assessments. The first is, what type of test are we going to administer? Will it be an achievement test or a proficiency test? Are we assessing our students for placement into a program? Are we doing a diagnostic assessment to find out what their strengths and weaknesses are? Is it a mastery test, or is it a criterion or norm reference test? So looking at what type of test that we're going to administer is an important first step. Who is also responsible for the various aspects of test development is another question we need to answer. Who's going to do what? The best test development projects are ones that are done in collaboration with colleagues. So it's really important to not take on a big project like this all by yourself, because you can become stressed out. So it's best to work in teams and that everybody knows what they're responsible for from the outset. Also, asking ourselves what information do we really need about our student achievement is important, and what are the learning or curricular outcomes or objectives that we're going to be testing. Now, another important question, and one I hope that everybody will answer yes to, is, are there specifications from which to work? A test specification is like a blueprint or a map to the test. Now, really good programs have a set of test specifications. Okay, so basically, if you've got a test specification, or a test spec for short, you basically use that as a map to design alternative versions of assessments. Another question to ask is, what types of items or tasks will you include on your test? Will they be subjective, or will they be objective, or will there be a balance of the two? What mode of testing will be used? Is it going to be a paper pencil test? Will it be a computer-based or adaptive test? Will it be a take-home test? Or will there be differences in the two? How long will the test be in terms of the amount of time we give our students and the number of test items we ask them to take? And how much weighting do we give the different sections of a test and the different items? All of these are questions that we must consider before we begin. Another question to consider is, where do we get our exam content? Well, of course, the answer is from our curriculum. The curriculum that we use should inform our teaching learning objectives, and it also has information on the levels that students need to reach. Also, the text types that are being utilized, the grammatical structures that are being looked at and studied, and the level of vocabulary our students need to be able to know. Another place we get our exam content from is from our course materials. And of course, our course materials, our textbooks, everything should support the curriculum. And they should provide models for the types of tasks that students will see on a test, the question types. One important thing to remember is to not include new item types or new task types on an assessment, because practice is needed beforehand. Okay, now it's fine to include new stuff, but not before we've practiced it in a low stakes classroom environment beforehand. And also, it should be noted that content should be similar to what is in the textbook, but we should not include, reading texts that are directly from the textbook that we've already covered in class. Content should be new, but it should be similar. Okay. What guiding principles do we need to keep in mind? And, for me as a tester, it's important to spend a little bit of time on what I call the cornerstones of assessment. And these cornerstones are the guiding principles that guide all assessments, not just English language assessments, but all assessments. So we're going to talk about each of these guiding principles in a little more depth. And we're going to start with validity, okay? So validity is basically, does the test measure what it is supposed to measure? And it is said by many to be the most important property of a good test. Now, there are a number of different types of validity. For me, I feel that the three most important types of validity for classroom teachers are content validity, construct validity, and face validity. Now, I'd like to guide you, if you have an interest in learning more about the other types of validity, I'd like to guide you to a publication that I put together in 2018 called An A to Z of Second Language Assessment, How Language Teachers Understand Assessment Concepts. This was published by the British Council, and it's a free download for anybody interested. And it's basically a glossary of testing terms that were written by teachers for teachers. Okay, so I encourage you to just Google that and take advantage of some of the activities that are in that, as well as some of the terms. So let's look at those three types of validities that I feel are important for teachers, or especially important. Content validity is basically assessing what and how we teach. So it goes without saying that we should not include questions on our tests of content that we haven't already taught. This is the number one type of validity. Everything on our test must be content that we have taught to our students. We also want to make sure we assess in ways that we've already taught our students. So that's why we shouldn't use formats that are new for our students. So we want to use formats and tasks that are familiar to them. Now, construct validity is where we need to have a fit between the type of teaching methodologies we use and the types of methodologies we use for assessment. So if we are using a communicative language teaching framework in our classes, that means our assessment methods or models should correspond to communicative language teaching. So we don't want a situation where we're teaching in a communicative language teaching way, but assessing through grammar translation, okay? So it's the underlying fit of the methodology we use to teach and the methodology we use to assess. Now, face validity refers to how a test looks, its credibility or acceptance as a measurement instrument based on how it looks. So we want to make sure that all of our tests don't have mistakes in them, don't have language mistakes or formatting mistakes, because this kind of thing can affect the face validity of our instrument. Reliability is another important cornerstone, and reliability means the consistency of our test scores. So if we give the same test at different times to the same students, if the test is reliable, the students will get more or less the same scores, okay? Now, reliability is also an important concept with regard to marking our assessments. So we want to make sure that when we're marking a section of a test, for example, the writing sample, we want to make sure that everybody who's marking it is on the same page with regard to the assessment criteria. Now, a number of factors affect a test's reliability: the way we construct our items, the formats we use, and the test length. Now, when we come up with a test, we want to make sure that we time the test correctly, okay? And a way to do that is when we create a test, we give our test to another teacher who hasn't participated in its development, and that teacher takes the test. We time that teacher. So let's say I'm doing a test. I'm going to give it to Nirmala to take. It takes her 15 minutes, okay? So how do I decide on the timing for my students? Well, if it takes Nirmala 15 minutes, we give our students anywhere from 3 to 4 times that amount. So the teacher, 15 minutes, The students, we need to give between 45 minutes to 1 hour. That's the rule of thumb for deciding on test length. Now, administrative factors play an important part as well. When we're giving a test to a large group of students, we want to ensure that the test room or the setting is similar, okay? Even things like the presence or absence of sunlight in a room, or air conditioning, or heat, even if you live in a cold environment, can affect a test reliability. The procedures that we use, we want to make sure that when we give like an IELTS exam or a TOEFL exam, there are written instructions, there's a script for the test proctor or invigilator to read out. So the reason for that is so that everybody gets the same instructions. The timing of the day is important as well. And strangely, right now, for me, it's 1:46 in the afternoon. I'm not sure what time it is for you, but I think you're later in the afternoon. Right now, this timing, late afternoon, especially in cultures where people are, they eat their big meal in the afternoon, this is the worst time to do a session, to give a test, to have a class. And it's especially problematic for my part of the world because here it is Ramadan. So it is the most difficult time in terms of timing during the day to give an assessment. With regard to scoring factors, we want to make sure there is a clear marking key, and we want to make sure that all the people marking the assessments have intra, meaning, and they are marking to the same internal standard within themselves, as well as the same inter-rater reliability, meaning amongst themselves. Affective factors play an important role, so we must make sure that our students have the requisite test-taking strategies that they need, and we also want to do whatever we can to reduce their anxiety with regard to tests. Practicality is another cornerstone, and this is teachers having the right amount of time and resources to do assessment in a successful way. So we want to think about the assessment cycle and plan in an adequate amount of time to not only develop, but to prepare, to grade, and analyze the test. We must remember that feedback is an important part of a test, so we must make sure that we've built in enough time to provide feedback to everybody involved. And practicality reasons are often the reason that teachers don't become involved in the assessment process, because once they do it once, they realize how much time it takes and they don't really want to do it again. Our next cornerstone is called Washback. And Washback is basically the effect that a test has on teaching and learning. Again, there are two types of washback: negative washback, the kind we don't want, and probably the most famous type of negative washback is teaching to the test. Positive washback is the type we want, where we learn something through test results that help us somewhere our students with their learning goals. Authenticity is one of the aims of communicative language teaching, and our goal as teachers. We want to prepare our students to function in the real world. So whenever possible, we need to make sure we use assessments that mirror real world situations and contexts. So we want to choose formats and tasks that our students would normally do in real life, and we want to use authentic target language as well. An advantage of authenticity as a cornerstone is that our students often find it very motivating. Transparency is yet another cornerstone, and this is the idea where students and teachers alike have clear, accurate information about how students will be assessed, and this information is available to them. Now, what types of information are needed to be transparent? Well, students need to know what they need to do to succeed. They need to know what kinds of content they can expect to find, what formats will be used on their tests, how much time they'll have, how much will each task or question be weighted, what are the grading criteria that will be used, like, for example, what is the writing scale, the grading scale, and any other useful feedback for improvement. would make a test more transparent. Now, we also need to think about security. We also, because, you know, these days, especially with online teaching and testing, we've got major security issues and major issues with cheating and plagiarizing. So we must, as an institution or as a department, have a policy on these kinds of things, on not only plagiarism and cheating, but also the security with which we store our assessments, okay? And there must, I feel, be severe consequences if anybody breaks these security issues. Okay, so there you have it, the cornerstones of testing. Now, let's move on now to talk a little bit about what qualities do good test developers need. Well, of course, they need to know about the curriculum, and they need to know about the material that they're being tested on. They also need to know about the instructional model that their institution is using, as well as the methodology that is being used. They need to understand who the test takers are and in which context they're studying in. And if they are lucky enough to have a test specification, they need to be able to work from a test specification. They need knowledge about the test types, the item formats, the weighting, and they need to have skills in item writing conventions. And if we've got time this afternoon, I'm going to take you through some of the pitfalls of item writing. Okay, so we'll focus on those if we've got enough time. And of course, you need to have a thick skin, because there's a lot of negative energy surrounding testing, because it happens at a time during the semester or year that everybody's stressed out, you know, they want to go to vacation. So oftentimes there's a lot of negativity put forward to the test, and hence the people who write the test. So having a thick skin and being able to accept criticism is a necessary characteristic of a good tester. So getting started, what to do first? Well, decide first who will develop the test. Hopefully it's going to be you and a team of colleagues. The ideal scenario is where it's you and a team of colleagues, and some of those colleagues know about testing and the others are teachers. So those two parties working together is the ideal scenario for test development. Then comes time to set a timeline for the stages in the process, then conducting an inner inventory about what needs to be tested by going through your curriculum, your syllabus, your course materials. Once you've conducted the inventory, classify this information by what you think is most important, and what is most important should be more heavily weighted than what is less important. Then create a plan or work from a test spec, and then make decisions about the types of items or tasks you're going to include. Will they be objective versus subjective items? Will they be traditional versus alternative? The one thing I really advise everyone for best practice is to use a multiple measures assessment scheme for your assessment. Multiple measures means, it means you, the teacher, you realize that you can never get all the information you need about your students' English language development by using one type of assessment. The best way to get all this information is to use a variety or multiple types of assessment. So you want to have some objective, some subjective. You want to have some traditional tests and quizzes, but you also want to have some alternative assessments like projects, like portfolios, presentations, etc. So those are some things to get started with. Okay, one decision you'll need to make is, should I use objective versus subjective test items or tasks? Well, here is a slide that tells you a little bit about the differences between these two. And my recommendation is that you use a variety of both, okay? So with objective type questions like MCQ, true, false, etc., these are called close-ended. These are short answer, closed response, and through this item type, you test mostly recognition, okay? There is little or no productive element. These types of questions are difficult to write well because you have to know what you're doing. You have to be trained. but they're quick and easy to grade. And you can include more open objective questions like MCQs on a test than you can subjective. So the more questions you have on the test, the more reliable that test is said to be. The workload for this type of test item is upfront in the development of the questions. Now, subjective test items where like essays or short answer questions, etc., they require a longer answer. The response is open, so students actually have to produce it. There's nothing there for them to guess from. These types of items are easy to write, but the work comes in the grading part. Because they're essays, because they're short answer questions, they take way more time than multiple choice questions to mark. And you have the issue of inter-rater reliability to consider, because all the teachers of a course are grading these questions, so they have to make sure they're giving the same number of points across, okay? Now, because you have fewer subjective questions, it means the test is not as reliable as one that has objective questions. And of course, the workload is post-test. So here are some advantages and disadvantages of objectively scored test items. Again, lots of advantages, just as many disadvantages as well. Now, I'm not going to go through all these advantages and disadvantages, but I will invite you at the end of this presentation to copy down my email. And if any of you would like a copy of this PowerPoint, all you have to do is email, okay, for your reference. All right. Now, one of the big issues with writing tests is through objective items, and there are a number of item violations which can occur. So I found that one of the best ways to help teachers develop their assessment literacy skills is to go through some of the major problems that teachers have with item types and give you an example of each, because presumably, if you can recognize these issues in test items that other people write, then hopefully you won't make the same mistakes as you can. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time going through each of these very quickly and showing you where the violation is. So we're going to start with queuing. A queuing item violation can occur in two places. And sometimes this is called the extraneous clue. So sometimes you can find the answer to an item, a clue to it within the item, or somewhere else on the test, okay? Here's an example. When you write for deposit only on a check, you are probably going to deposit money into your account. So the use of the word deposit and deposit is a clue to that being the correct answer. That's a queuing violation. The second is a 3-for-1 split. Now, this is where 3 of your response options are A, B, C, and D, where 3 of those are parallel, but the 4th one is different. Sometimes people call this one the odd man out. So I want you, as I read this one, I'd like you to think about what is the 3-for-1 split. The hotel, and add in the newspaper to recruit new employees. So the response options, A, B, C, D, what is the 3-for-1 split? Think about it. Well, the 3-for-1 split here is 3 verb forms, A, B, and C, and 1 noun form placement, D. Now, what happens in a 3-for-1 split? Well, sometimes if students don't know the answer to the question, they pick the one that looks different. So a 3-for-1 split is only really serious if the one that is different is the correct answer. Now, in this case, it is not, okay? But you want to be careful with 3-for-1 splits. Impure test items are items that test more than one thing. So ideally, a test item should test only one thing. This particular example tests 2 things. It tests verb form as well as word order. Okay, so that's an impure test item. A subsuming item violation is where the correct answer is included in another answer that is assumed as being correct on a different level. It sounds a bit complicated, but it's easy when you look at this example. So this is a listening item, and it's a short dialogue. John says, "We need to buy some new office furniture." Mike replies, "Okay, I'll call the supply company." John says, "Just don't get the metal ones, please." The question is, what will Mike order? Now you notice that since this is a listening item, there are only 3 response options for listening items because people don't have access to listening to the test multiple times. For reading, there would be 4 because students can go back and forth to the text numerous times, but for listening, they can't. So what will Mike order? Now, some of you might have said office furniture, and that would be correct on a higher level. However, the true key to this question or correct answer is comfortable chairs, because Mike says, just don't get the metal ones, please. Okay. So this works grammatically as being the correct answer, but comfortable chairs are part of office furniture. So this could be confusing because both B and C could be keyable or deemed as correct. And any time in a multiple choice question where you have more than one correct answer, that's not a good test item, okay? An apples and oranges test violation is where you have 2 and 2 that are different or that are the same. So here you have 2 adverbs of frequency and 2 prepositional phrases. So these should be avoided whenever possible, unless of course you're doing subject pronouns versus object pronouns, for example, or affirmative and negative. Unparalleled options are where response options are not parallel, both in the length and in the grammar structure. So let's imagine this is a reading question. According to the text, how do most people from Columbus go to work? So we have A, by bus. B, they go by taxi. C, most of them drive. D, walk. So you can see the difference in grammaticality, okay? You can also see the difference in length. 2 of them are way longer than the other 2. And one of the test taking strategies that students have when they answer multiple choice questions is, if you don't know the correct answer, choose the longest answer. And more often than not, the longest answer is the correct answer. Gender representation is when we use vocabulary that is gender specific. So we need to be able to, at least in Western countries, okay, these kinds of things are important. So we should not use terms that are sexist, okay? We should try to use gender neutral terms. So the term here that is considered sexist in Western cultures is the term mailman. Why? Because there are plenty of women who deliver the mail, at least in my country. So a better term for that would be mail carrier, because that's gender neutral, okay? Inflammatory tone is where you use materials that have a negative impact emotionally on students. Here's one from my part of the world. I live in the Gulf. Many American soldiers in the Gulf right now. Now, this is not so negative. Why? Because I live in the UAE and we're at peace, thank God. But there could be other places in the Gulf that are, that are in terms of conflict. So you don't want to remind students about something that could be negatively emotionally charged for them, okay? A double key, this is where you have more than one response option be correct. Now, this is the most commonly made mistake in writing multiple choice questions that teachers make ever. So when you have more than one correct answer, Being keyable, this is not a good thing. So of course, the two keyable responses would be A and C here. The second most common mistake made in MCQ item writing by teachers is the no key. So when you, and this often happens when an item goes through several rewrites. So people often rewrite the question stem, but then they forget to update the list of responses. So of course, this is the student who I told you about yesterday. That response option is missing from the list of alternatives. Implausibility is where teachers use absurd or what are called giveaway distractors to round out their list of response options. Now, some teachers do this because they want to joke around, they want to be funny, but this is not something that should take place on it. This is something that it's okay to do in class to have fun, but in a test, every response option in the list of A, B, C, D should be have the potential to draw students, to attract students to it. And of course, the giveaway distractor here is, of course, D, Disneyland. The use of outside background knowledge should be, we need to think about that. Now, we learn in our methods classes, especially in reading, that when we teach our students how to read, they need to use their background knowledge, the knowledge they already have in their head, and it needs to interact with what they're reading or listening to. Now, this is a good strategy when we teach, but it is not a good strategy when we test, because we do not want our students to be able to answer test questions based on background knowledge. Let's imagine we have a test on smoking, okay? And one of the questions is a true false. Smoking is dangerous for your health. Do students need to read a text on smoking to know the answer to that? No, they do not. So we do not want students to be able to answer questions based on background knowledge. Trickiness are points that are notoriously confusing even for native speakers of a language. I've used, my example here is, even as an educated native speaker, I always have problems remembering the difference between affect with an E and affect with an A. So again, one or two tricky questions on a test are okay, but we do not want to have, 30 questions out of 30 focusing on tricky points or especially difficult points. Insensitivity means using content that is shocking or upsetting to test takers. Again, for any of you, this would be shocking for my part of the world. In the UAE, we have a big highway called Sheikh Zayed Road, which everybody in the country knows. And there are a lot of serious car accidents, etc. So we don't want to remind people during a test of maybe someone losing a family member or a friend in a car accident on this road. Remember, we want to decrease student anxiety among testing, not increase it. Using inappropriate terminology is another thing we have to think about. We want to avoid politically correct vocabulary. Here, the word crippled or disabled is considered to be politically incorrect terminology. So let's finish up with a few tips for writing multiple choice questions for our objective test. Well, when we write a question, the question should be clear in the stem. They also need to be, the questions need to be clear, precise, and simple. And 4 options are optimal for MCQs. 1 must be the unambiguous correct answer. The exception to this rule is the listening item, where we should use 3 response options. All response options should be literally the same length and the same difficulty level, and most probably the same grammatical structure. The correct answer should require some sort of processing, not just a selective verbatim, not just word for word matching from the text. And the answer should appear equally in all positions. Like 25% of the answers should be A, 25% B, 25% C, 25% D. You should avoid using things like all of the above, never, always, absurd, or giveaway distractors, cues, and items, correct items that are based on answering the previous item in a correct way. So all items should be independent of one another. You should avoid jargon and textbook language as well. And make sure you eliminate any sources of real difficult. An example of that is the double negative. I recommend as well placing all items of the same type in the same section. Could somebody turn their mic off, please? The sound that you're making is distracting. Could I ask everybody but me to turn their mics off? Thank you. So place all items of the same type in the same section. So have an MCQ section, have a true false, have a fill in the blank, etc. Now, when you're writing the test as well, make sure you prepare the answer key and the model answer at the same time as the test. So that's ready to go. Another useful rule as well is the 30-40-30 rule. When you design a test, 30% of your items on that test should be easy, so that even the students who are not so knowledgeable about test content can have a chance at answering some items. An additional 40% of your test items should be mid-range in difficulty, and the remaining 30 should be challenging questions that are designed for the students who are the higher achievers, etc. The one thing you should always do is start. Question number 1 should be an easy question. The reason for that is when a student gets an easy question as their first question, their anxiety levels immediately reduce and they can continue onwards with the test in a more relaxed manner. If you use a difficult question as question number 1, students' anxiety levels rise and they have a more difficult time controlling this anxiety. Present the questions in the same order as they appear in the text, and make sure that you standardize word count, readability levels, or skills like reading and listening. This kind of information should be in your test specifications. Okay. Use appropriate formula for calculating how much time a student needs.
Yes, okay.
Got it. Okay.
Sorry.
No problem. Make sure you have somebody look over your test items, put together a practice test for your students, and make sure answer keys are ready to go as soon as you've given the test. Okay. So final steps. If possible, run test statistics on your assessment. Provide students and everybody else with feedback in a timely manner, and take time to reflect on your assessment. Give Washback, give information from the test to all the appropriate people, and then before you put that test away in your filing cabinet, make decisions on its future. If you had minor changes to the test to make it better, you will want to use that test again. If the students didn't perform as well as you'd hoped, you might retire the test and move it to a practice exam. But if your test was a total disaster, you might want to retire it completely, okay, and not use any part of it again. So make decisions on a test future before you move on to the next test. Then, of course, sit back and relax after a job well done. So there you have it, my name, my email, my contact, if you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint. I'm not sure. It looks like I've finished directly on time, but if we have time for questions, I'm happy to answer any you might have. Any questions or comments that any of you might want to make? Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay, I guess I'm finished. Thank you very much. Great to be here. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you very much for your wonderful, very insightful presentation, ma'am. Could you please tell us some tips about preparing the subjective types of question also, ma'am?
Okay. Well, subjective types of test questions are important, and they're one of the easiest types to do, but unfortunately, they require a lot of work post-test to get them marked and to get them marked reliably. You want to, the biggest thing that you want to make sure, if I had one tip to give everybody of making a subjective type question, is you want to make sure, because they're open-ended questions. So you want to make sure that you don't give a subjective question that is a yes/no question, because lots of new teachers write yes/no questions, which only really require a yes or a no, which means it's not an effective subjective question. So you might add to a yes/no question, why not? That means you're getting people to, you're encouraging people to write more on that question. But one of the big problems you want to also think about is that those subjective questions, like short answer questions, are very amenable to memorization, which I don't think we really want to encourage in our assessment, in our teaching, learning, and assessment. So I think that's the subjective testing. That's the topic for another whole presentation. Unfortunately, we don't have time for. Okay, thank you, everybody. Okay, hope it proved useful. I hope to get some emails from you requesting the PowerPoint for your records.
Now, thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for your wonderful sharing on best practices in exam development, reliability, validity, practicality, negative Washback effect, authenticity, transparency, security. All these are the elements of a good test. And of course, this presentation will help the teachers to make the questions, test papers based on your presentation. Thank you for sharing the tips for writing MCQs and objective test items. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. Over to you, Janakshar.